Hello and welcome to Bardling's Banter. My name is Matthew and I make videos about Dungeons and Dragons. Specifically, I make videos to help new players become better role players. I write short stories to help people visualize what is happening on the battle map and to better show just how far you can take things. A balance of lore, mechanics, and chaotic inspiration. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I invite you all to share, like, comment, and subscribe. Particularly comment, as it really helps me know what questions you guys have. That way I can better cater my videos to what you actually want to know. Today's video is about the Elves, specifically the culture and language of the Elves. Like my previous video about the Dwarves, this is not a deep dive into the history of the Elves, though that is going to be involved pretty heavily this time because their history is well documented. So without further ado, let's get into it. The Elves were sent by the Fae, the Archfey from the Feywild, to defend the Fae crossings in Toril. Most of these crossings obviously being in great forests and glades, places where the borders between the Primaterial Plane and Feywild are thinner. So half of their job was obviously to defend these Fae crossings. The other half was actually to fight the dragons. During this time, dragons really there really weren't any such thing as good dragons, really. At best, there were some of them that could be considered benevolent, tyrannical masters. But at the end of the day, a benevolent tyrannical master is still a tyrannical master. The first group of elves to come to Toril were the Green Elves, who look exactly like this, and exactly the way you expect them to. They worshipped nature. They were also called Wild Elves. They're not as common anymore, and most of them are now what are called Wood Elves, which are quite common and very popular to play as. The Green Elves stayed to the woods. They didn't build any great cities or monuments. They worshipped nature spirits and the Archfey from the Feywild and got their power from nature itself. Along with the Green Elves, Winged Elves also came over to Toril. You don't hear about them much, though they do still exist in small numbers. You don't hear about them because they weren't particularly successful. When they came, they were immediately attacked by dragons and all but destroyed. There are some living in Toril now, but by no means are they considered common. Second wave of elves that came over were actually the Dark Elves, not to be confused with the Drow. That came later, and they were created from the Dark Elves, or rather from Lolth. Unlike the rest of the subspecies of elves, the Dark Elves actually ended up allying themselves with the dragons, as much as you can ally yourself with a megalomaniac, narcissistic tyrant. The Dark Elves were considered the dragon's servants and slave masters. For this, they were given land and a city, and they were left alone by the dragons to a degree. But again, they were servants and slave masters of these dragons. What do I mean by that? They actively went out and captured intelligent species, including other elves, and brought them to the dragons to be servants and slaves. So the people, and I hear this all the time, that, oh, the Dark Elves and the Drow, they were just misunderstood. No, that sounds great, but really they set themselves up from the beginning to be the enemy of pretty much everyone around them. The third group of elves that came over from the Feywild consisted of 50 sun and 1 moon elf. There are many books and articles about their arrival, touching on the major points here. They did not come willingly. They actually came to escape a disaster, a cataclysm that they themselves actually caused. If you read into the history and really get into the history of the elves, you'll see that that's kind of a theme. For a race that is incredibly long-lived, they are uncommonly short-sighted, especially when it comes to things that will grant them power. The biggest difference, I would say, between the dwarves and the elves are where the dwarves are all about the power, power as a people, as a collective. The dwarves are strong, kind of that one for all for one mentality. The elves are all about personal freedom. Keep in mind, they come from fey creatures. Personal freedom is everything to them. They're all about personal freedom, and because of that, personal power. Because if you want to have that freedom, you have to have the power to back it up. The last group of elves came and immediately started fighting the dragons. They didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. They did manage to build a society, homes for themselves, cities. Again, I am casting a wide stroke pen on, thousands of years of fantasy history. So if you want to know more and more specifics, by all means ask questions in the comment section. Also, I invite you all to go to AJ Pickett's channel. He's another YouTuber who does deep dives into history. There you can find very specific dates and times of when major events happened. So what you kind of saw as a big theme here is the High Elves, consisting of the Sun and Moon Elves, fighting a war against the dragons, and by proxy against the Dark Elves, but no one would say that. The Green Elves, they were more concerned about defense. They were in their woods. Some of them helped the High Elves, of course, but as a group they stayed to their woods, and as long as the woods were safe and the woods were defended, they didn't really take part in anything major. Getting back to the language of the elves, the language of the elves, it actually comes from the Moon Elf language. At one time, the Moon Elves were the most populous type of elf on Toril. So their language actually became the lingua franca of trade amongst the elves. Additionally, the Moon Elves were probably the most open and receptive to new ideas. The Dark Elves were closed off by their very definition, and the Sun Elves thought themselves way too, great to need any other race's help. Additionally, Moon Elves were probably the most receptive to the idea of mixing with the species and bloodlines. So that's really where we got half-elves from. If you're a half-elf, chances are your elven lineage probably came from Moon Elves. Additionally, going back to the language again, the elven language is called Esprar. Again, that's the Moon Elf language. That clearly came from the Sylvan language of the Fey world. So, if you're an elf, obviously you speak Common and Elven, and chances are pretty good that you also speak Sylvan. Additionally, if you're playing a drow, you probably speak Undercommon, and you might not necessarily speak Sylvan, but it wouldn't be unheard of or odd. Two events in history that I do want to talk about in this history, really to give you an idea of the elven culture and elven mindset. The first was the Mythal that the High Elves created. Mythal is a great magical work involving hundreds or even thousands of high mages to complete. This first Mythal was the Dragon Rage Mythal that they completed to help fight the dragons. What did it do? If the King Killer Star was within view of someone with draconic blood, they would become aggressive to the point where they would just go into a rage. This would last 10 to 60 days, depending on, the position of the stars, obviously. And it did its job. The dragons became very rageful. They were little more than beasts, and they would destroy everything within sight. They would kill each other. They would kill any other creature they could find. So the dragons' numbers were depleted. So from the High Elves' perspective, this was a great success. But from the Dark Elves' perspective, this was an act of war. Obviously, there were many of these dragons living in their cities. Additionally, many Dark Elves had some, draconic heritage at this point. You know, so all of these creatures were affected by this mythal and just destroyed their capital city. The second thing I wanted to talk about is kind of a two-parter, because really one came before, you know, without one there wasn't the other. Because of all of these dragons who were no longer there because, you know, they were killed in the infighting from the Dragon's Rage mythal, which, by the way, went on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Anyway, there was an orc invasion. Simply because there were no dragons, the orcs' numbers skyrocketed, and they eventually attacked the Sun Elf capital city of Obsidian, and they destroyed it completely. And they would have also destroyed the Moon Elf city if it wasn't for some timely maneuvers and the two elves, you know, two groups saving each other. But their numbers were decimated. After this, there was really a push from, you know, the High Elves to find, or create rather, their own home. So they decided, and this took hundreds of years, to create a mythal that would create an island out in the sea, out in the ocean. This was done with the help of many mages of many different, you know, species: humans, elf, dwarf. The one leading it was actually a green elf. The only group that wasn't invited or told about it were the Dark Elves. So the island of Evermeet was created in this grand mythal, and suddenly there was an island in the middle of an ocean that beforehand there wasn't any. This affected the world in many ways, magically, as well as just basic laws of physics. That being the displacement of all of that water. All that water had to go somewhere. So the sea levels rose. Additionally, there were typhoons and great hurricanes and earthquakes. And the result was the loss of millions of lives along the coast of Toril, specifically Faerun, that resulted in basically the destruction of the Dark Elves' culture. After this, the Dark Elves never again trusted the High Elves. It's unknown, really, if the High Elves knew that this was going to happen, but I think they might have. But really, this moment, and some of the moments that are after, with the Crown Wars, and then the Second Sundering, really solidified the relations between the Dark Elves and the High Elves, even without taking the acts of the goddess Lolth into account, and eventually, you know, changing some, if not all, depending on, you know, which canon you prescribe to, of the Dark Elves into what we know now as the Drow, who live in the Undercities underneath Faerun and are decidedly evil. To get more information about the Drow and their culture, I invite you all to look at the works of R.J. Salvatore and his series about the legend of Drizzt. And there are many other books, but that's just like a really good starting point to get an idea of the culture of Lolth's Drow and Menzoberranzan. There are two groups of elves, and I'm using a very big asterisk after the word elf for one of them that I want to just touch on briefly, because one of them is a optional sub-race that you can play as. That one being the Eladrin. The Eladrin are natives to the Feywild. They are elves that stayed in the Feywild and have decided, purposely or accidentally, to come to whatever world your campaign is in. They're very unique, they're very special, and they're very fun to play as. The second group of elven creature, and I'm using air quotes here, are called the O'Shea. They aren't really elves. There's something else. There's something before the Elves, or after the Elves. It's hard to say for sure because the O'Shea actually, chronologically speaking, destroyed their own timeline. They come from a reality that no longer exists, but a couple of them live in Toril. The O'Shea can be called the creator race of the Elves, but really they're an enigma wrapped within a riddle. They're the ones who are talking about, oh, that which was and will never be again, and they really won't talk about their past because it's just too painful for them. So that was a brief dive into the culture and history of the Elves. I hope that helps you with your roleplay and your character concept. But really what I actually hope is that it helps you know what questions to ask and what things to research. So, until next time, this has been Matthew wishing you all 1d10 worth of inspiration.